Coming up now on Headline Humboldt, the Sheriff's Office has identified the deputy who shot and killed an armed shooting suspect in Cutten earlier this month, as the Humboldt County Grand Jury separately recommends a Citizens Advisory Committee to oversee the department. Also, 4th District Supervisor Natalie Arroyo joins us to talk about the county's ailing budget and apparently declining cannabis industry and how wind power may well transform our community. Coming up now on Headline Humboldt. From the top of Humboldt Hill, this is Headline Humboldt. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. The cycles of boom or bust in local government are something that has long plagued communities up and down the state, but especially in regions where there are more trees and trails than people, places like Humboldt County. Due partly to unfunded mandates from the state legislature and an evaporating tax base, the relationship between counties and Sacramento has become more and more complicated and based on dependency. And where in some years the state may be broke but the county flush, or vice versa, the Armageddon moments arise when both the county and the state governments are strapped for cash and both look to the other for increased support. If neither have the necessary resources, you can expect cuts, often deep, to the programs and services that impact ordinary people. It's up to our elected leaders to weigh the potential consequences and make those cuts and changes in places that leave the best opportunity for future recovery and success. Tonight we speak with 4th District Supervisor Natalie Arroyo about the budget, about the future of the cannabis industry in Humboldt County, and how wind power represents a massive opportunity as well as a risk for Humboldt County's residents. But first, the news. This week, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office released the name of the deputy involved in a recent Cutten shooting that left a man dead after an elderly woman had been shot. This comes as the Humboldt County Grand Jury recently recommended that the county establish a Citizens Advisory Committee to oversee the department and make recommendations, as well as an Inspector General. According to the Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant Conan Moore was the deputy who fired the shot on April 25th that ultimately killed 32-year-old Kevin Burks. Moore is a 15-year law enforcement veteran and is currently on paid leave. Deputies were originally notified that an elderly woman had been shot by an unknown assailant at the corner of Cedar and Fern Streets in Cutten. Police arrived and located Burks, who had fled into a nearby home. He appeared shortly afterward with a firearm and was subsequently shot by Moore, authorities said. The victim in this case is recovering in a rehabilitation facility. This is the third time Lieutenant Moore has fired his weapon in the line of duty. He previously shot suspect Jesse Widmark in the leg following a 2023 chase. He also fired upon a vehicle containing 2 suspects that was driving at him during an incident in Lolita in 2013. The case is currently being investigated by the Humboldt County Critical Incident Response Team. But I want to be clear, the recent recommendation by the Humboldt County Grand Jury for a Citizens Advisory Committee to oversee the Sheriff's Office, as well as the establishment of an Inspector General position, were unrelated to the shooting. The now unfolding process to turn Humboldt County into a major wind power generator for the state of California received coverage from the Brookings Institute this week through its podcast Reimagine Rural with host Anthony Pippa. Supervisor Natalie Arroyo and Bryna Lipper from the Humboldt Area Foundation, among others, spoke in the episode about the need to embrace this change for economic potential, and while at the same time making sure we determine our own destiny and don't fall victim to a harrowing and depersonalized process.
We have incredible wind resources here, and we recognize as a community, I think that that's an asset. I will tell you that in May, when the wind is blowing nonstop for days at a time, it doesn't always feel like an asset. This last year, I was reminded we have very, very windy springs and we have wind all year round, but there's periods of time where I'm like, for the love of God, will it stop being windy? And then I remember, oh yeah, that's what we've got. That's something we have to work with.
In December 2022, the federal government auctioned nearly 600 square miles of ocean access off Humboldt Bay and Morro Bay, which is much further south in California, to 5 energy companies. The plan near Humboldt is to build giant 900-foot-tall wind turbines in deep waters more than 20 miles off the coast, to harness the wind and send its energy back to shore as electricity. These massive windmills will be 3 times larger than the ones you see on land. Think the size of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, floating on the ocean. One estimate is that offshore wind farms like the one proposed here could power 25 million homes by 2045 and provide 13% of the power supply needed by the state of California, which is the 5th largest economy in the world right now. Some estimates put that proportion of energy even higher. Any way you look at it, that's a lot more power than Humboldt County needs for itself. It's also a significant economic opportunity. And it's not just a project to erect wind turbines. As Bryna Lipper, Executive Director of the Humboldt Area Foundation, says, this will require a whole set of related investments.
What we began to realize was the offshore wind development itself, the wind farms, were only one of a series of many cascading activities that we call the offshore wind cluster. That includes a massive port development. That includes transmission systems and the grid systems in the state of California and the state of Oregon. All of a sudden, when you're crossing state boundaries, you're actually talking about FERC with the federal government and thinking about the local infrastructure that would be needed to support all of that. Housing, transportation and roadways, workforce systems, and the such. And so you began looking at this massive industrial complex that needed to be developed here in order to enable offshore wind.
Joining me now in studio is 4th District Supervisor Natalie Arroyo. I'm having a hard time with that word today, supervisor, but yeah.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So wind power, let's start there. I have a whole list of questions to talk about, of course, but wind power, this project is something that has already brought a fair amount of money into Humboldt County, $426 million, which is a lot of money that we typically don't see in an area like this. And it's going to, in a lot of ways, change the face of the waterfront. I wonder if people don't necessarily realize what that change means yet in terms of the skyline and stuff, and then ultimately having turbines in the ocean that are tall. But what are your thoughts about that? And I noticed that in the podcast, there was this expression that he used repeatedly that people want to make sure that this project doesn't happen to them, to us, but rather that we have a hand in shaping what it turns out to be. What do you think that means? I mean, what are you worried about with the wind power project?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot to parse there. So I will say, when it comes to the project that's in federal waters, those wind turbines will be, more than 20 miles off our coast, so they will be visible from certain locations. There'll be small red lights, small to us, from 20 plus miles away that we'll be able to see at night. We don't know yet, exactly what the configuration will look like in the ocean, but that is in federal waters, so that's subject to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management process that's really facilitating that. From our perspective, the $420 plus million that you referred to is a project of the Harbor District, so to really enhance and upgrade the port. So that's a separate piece of the project, but that would certainly be, I think, the greatest visual impact for most of us here in the Humboldt Bay area, greater Humboldt Bay area. Maybe from up here on Humboldt Hill, you could see those turbines in the ocean, but most of us won't be seeing them.
But if we build the turbines in the bay, they're going to be in the bay and
they will be in the bay,
and we'll be seeing a lot of them, coming and going at least at times.
Exactly, yeah. And we just went to the East Coast. A delegation of folks from Humboldt County went through grant funding that was really for educational purposes only. We had an opportunity to go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where there's currently a turbine assembly location in the port, and see what those look like. Those would be a different type of turbine than what we would have here, and a different type of base. But it was still really helpful to see nonetheless, what the scale is that we're talking about. Some pretty interesting and innovative equipment was needed to make that happen, and just how much physical space is needed to assemble these things. So just from a pure construction and engineering standpoint, it was really interesting to see.
Yeah. Now, one of the things the host mentioned in the show is that this potentially could be the biggest project to ever happen in Humboldt County, and that sort of boggles the mind as there have been major projects up here. But I mean, talk a little bit about what this could bring. I mean, we've talked about it before, but in terms of jobs and sustainability economically, what does it mean to have something like this come up here?
Yeah, I think it's a huge economic opportunity, that's for sure. I know Bryna said that there'll be lots of construction-related jobs. There's opportunity for people in the trades. We don't have a recent history, a lot of folks in the organized labor community really participating in the job market here as much. So this is an opportunity for new trades and more trades to be located here and to train young people to do that type of skilled work. I also think there's an opportunity with some of the auxiliary projects, like when it comes to the transmission infrastructure. We're slated to have some significant upgrades to both substations and transmission lines that will increase our energy reliability in this area as well. So that's all, I think there are some auxiliary benefits that will really help us. And as you mentioned earlier, we really do need to pay attention to the potential impacts of these projects and look to mitigate those to the extent possible. And I am encouraged to see that this framework of having community benefits agreements and some tribal community benefits agreements is something that's come out with other wind power projects and other energy projects. So I'm encouraged to see that.
Does the fact that some of the tribes have been standoffish about it, does that affect your view of it, or is that, do you think, just part of the process to get to where everyone's giving the green light?
I think they're really giving that feedback largely to the federal government at this point, as well as to the Harbor District. I think we all need to be paying attention to that. And when I look at the language of what was in those letters, a lot of it was about, being really heavily engaged with the projects. And right now, they're not feeling like that level of engagement has been happening, and have learned some lessons from how things have transpired on the East Coast and what tribes have experienced there. Yeah. So I think, it was a strong warning to everybody to stay engaged and to engage with tribes as we go through this process. But I didn't think it was, an end to the conversation by any means.
Yeah, and I didn't get that impression either, but it was strongly worded, but I think that they were trying to, draw a line and say we have to negotiate.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that strong position.
Absolutely.
And I think it's warranted.
Yeah, thank you. The original reason why I wanted you on the show is the budget situation for the county and for the state. They put out their revised budget, which I'll ask you about in a little bit. But from what I understand, and I may be totally wrong, so correct me if I am, but $12.4 million in the hole for the next fiscal year, and you guys are sort of in the process of trying to figure out where that money is going to come from and how you're going to fill that gap, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. So we've had double-digit, million-dollar deficits that we've had to fill from fund balance in previous years. So now this is only my second budget cycle as a supervisor, but last year we were in a similar position where we had, an excess of $10 million of revenue shortfall, and so we were able to make up for that with fund balance that we have from prior years and from socking away funds. But we're starting to see that in a couple of years we will run out of that fund balance, and then we will really need to curtail expenses significantly. So we're having the conversation now about, yes, we have a deficit. Right now we can fill it with some fund balance, but is there any way we can bring that down so that we can get rid of the structural deficit? And if we don't do that, we'll be in a tough place in a couple of years. Right now, we're not, talking about significant changes to our staffing, but we don't want to get to that place.
Yeah. Now, you are on the ad hoc budget committee, right?
Yes, myself and Michelle Bushnell.
Yeah, that's a lot of work. Considering the import of that issue. What have you guys been doing, and what does that work look like from your end?
So we met with every single department, and there are many departments within the county. We met with every single department in person and talked through their budget, talked through any additional requests for general fund revenue that they're making this year in this year's budget cycle, and then also broke the news about I would say the extent of the structural deficit that we're wanting to address, so that we could start to get buy-in for essentially austerity measures now, and any potential recommendations around efficiency or reorganization within departments that those department heads can make. And we're going to be having that conversation in just a couple of weeks, where all of the recommendations are going to come back to our board. So we're having the conversation about this year's budget right now, but this multi-year deficit issue and how to address that on a more structural level, we're going to be talking about right on the heels of our regular budget cycle.
Sure, and then with the state having its own issues as well, that compounds the problem ultimately. So can you explain for us what was going on with the TOT tax issue at the recent meeting? And there were people there from the arts community, from the City Council of Eureka, Leslie Castellano, talking about the importance of that kind of funding, how ultimately it can bring money in. And that just sort of demonstrates how complicated these issues are, because if you cut something that produces revenue, you're shooting yourself in the foot for future years when that might not be the wisest choice. But can you explain what the TOT tax issue is and
Sure.
where it stands now?
So we were talking about Measure J specifically, which was an addition of a couple percentage points to that transient occupancy tax. That's a tax that's charged to people who stay in hotels, so people who visit and stay in hotels or campgrounds. And those revenue streams are, were really discussed in the community as being for not only public services, but also the arts and culture community. But like many tax measures, the language was very robust about what it wanted to achieve. And when it comes time to figure out how to allocate that, that's really challenging. So I will say in this last year and a half, we've allocated, $880,000 for one full year, and the previous year, half of that, so $440,000. So 1.2 million-ish, a little more, to a suite of projects. So one of those was public safety related. The sheriff's office got some funds. We funded arts and culture needs. We funded the Humboldt and Del Norte Film Commission. So they have been putting on the Forest Moon Festival, which has really brought in a lot of tourism
I love it.
and revenue, and it's really fun,
Yes,
right?
exactly,
We can't just talk about money.
Yeah.
All of those things together were funded, and now, I would say our board is just under immense pressure to try to conserve funds that the county has discretion over. So that's really what's at the heart of the conversation. When it comes to, in a couple of years, thinking about potential staff reductions, which we hope we don't get to. But I think we're under a lot of pressure from within our own organization to not get to that place.
Yeah, how do you approach it as a public servant? I mean, what are you trying to keep in your mind as you're hearing these stories? And everyone's got real needs, and whatever you cut is going to have a potential impact down the road.
Yeah.
What do you keep in mind as you're working through that stuff?
So I keep in mind that, I'm responsible for employing thousands of people within our organization, and that I'm responsible for serving the greater community and listening to what the community feedback is. A lot of folks who voted for Measure J overwhelmingly wanted to see it support the arts, and I've heard from a lot of those community members already and in the last year. And so, weighing those two things is really challenging. I will say I am a firm believer that, we need to make ourselves a destination for more than just one or two things. We need to ensure that, particularly when it comes to tourism or people moving and staying here or keeping our residents here who are big contributors to the local community, that we need to think about what kind of quality of life they have too. We can't just fund government services, which of course contribute to quality of life too, but we also, there's an element of joy that's hard to replace with other government services that the arts and culture community really brings.
And character and all kinds of things.
Character and I will say, there's a relevance to thinking about tourism and what draws people here as well, because we know we are a big tourist destination.
Absolutely, and that's been one of the things that's been our saving grace as we kind of shuffle between legacy industries and wind power and other things that may be coming or not. I mean, that's been the mainstay.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't want to kill your golden goose, right?
Sure don't.
Now, one of the things that came up with the Measure Z funds, and I was reading some articles and they're talking about how that's been decreasing. Can you talk a little bit about the role that plays, if that's a big concern that you're having, and what does that look like long term? I mean, those things are set up to be temporary, so I mean.
Yeah, so I will say consumer spending really seems like it's taking a little bit of a downturn right now, statewide and locally. So, we always plan conservatively for things that are essentially sales tax revenue. And this is one where we're seeing a little decline, and that, just reflects inflation and consumer habits right now. So we are projecting less in Measure Z, but we've also seen the fixed costs go up. Measure Z has historically been allocated to some county positions that just inherently the costs grow over time, associated with benefits and all that, and those are just things that inherently go up. So we're dealing with a smaller and smaller amount of Measure Z funds that can be allocated based on the committee's recommendations, but we do still have a very active, very engaged Measure Z committee. They've done great work this year and brought us a good set of recommendations that we were all able to agree on unanimously, so that was great to see.
Is that going to expire eventually, the Measure Z, or is that the permanent hike?
We really need to create some more guidance for that committee over time. I would say in the next couple of years there will continue to be funds to allocate. If we see a change in our sales tax base, that may change also, so it could go up or down. It's hard to say right now, but I will say that at least in the next few years, we anticipate continuing to fund, rural fire departments, volunteer fire departments that really don't have a lot of other funding streams.
They depend on it.
They absolutely depend on it. Rural ambulance service, and quite a few other services that have historically gotten Measures E funds.
Yeah. The governor released his revised budget. It still needs to be, I think they have until the middle of June 15th, deadline to approve it. Have you had a chance to take a look or get an update on it at all?
I've gotten updates about some of the impacts of the budget. It does sound like the Department of Health and Human Services will have some impacts, but we're really still digesting those. The governor released those recommendations and the legislature is still chewing on them. Yeah. And unfortunately, the timing isn't great for us. We also adopt our budget in June, so by the time they approve it, we will have essentially adopted our budget already.
So you're both kind of juggling unknowns at this point, trying to figure out, you, the county especially.
Absolutely. So we're dealing with quite a number of unknowns this year, which makes the budgeting process all the harder. And I think, from an outside perspective, community members sometimes are critical, that's maybe putting it gently, critical of those of us in government, thinking like, can't they just balance their checkbook? And it's much more complicated than that, in that some revenue streams, sometimes we'll be holding on to a fund balance or waiting for repayment or compensation on grants or for other programs for years. And so it's a very complicated mix. But we'll definitely be seeing some impacts from the state budget contracting a bit.
That's, sort of the go time when both entities are strapped for cash and everyone's scrounging for what they can save or preserve or cut.
Yep, and I would say that none of the areas that I've seen that have been cut are fat. Like, I don't think there's much fat to cut when it comes to some of these programs that help a lot of the most vulnerable community members, for example, or, help to really advance public health objectives, or, and I don't frankly think there's a ton of fat in our county budget either. So we'll be in an interesting place to kind of figure out our priorities. And I'll say from my perspective, I think a more equitable kind of percentage-based cut is easier to stomach for everyone.
So
than,
like you say 5% across departments or something
yeah,
like that.
that kind of thing is easier to me to advance than something that is a deep cut to just one or two departments.
Because,
they all have value.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Now, one of the things that's come out recently is that Proposition 1 passed. It barely squeaked by. This is the initiative by the governor to try and provide more rehab housing and treatment beds for people who are struggling with drug dependency. And $3.3 billion in bonds has been approved, and the governor's been making some noise about the partnership with counties in this effort. And has been rather, I thought, confrontational with it, basically saying either you're either with us or against us or something along those lines. Can you talk a little bit about how you imagine Proposition 1 is going to impact the county, and what's up with the confrontational dialoguing we have going on from Sacramento?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the governor meant by that. I'm guessing that if I'm reading the tea leaves, you're sort of asking me to interpret what that meaning was. I believe that that's aimed at folks who perhaps didn't want behavioral health facilities, particularly to treat severely mentally ill patients in their communities, or they've balked at finding those locations or prioritizing those uses. I don't think that's true of Humboldt County. In fact, we've worked really hard to advance a new behavioral health facility in Arcata in conjunction with Mad River, and that project's still moving along, and some other projects here in Eureka. So I like to think that we're doing our part, but perhaps some communities have been a little slow to adapt to those needs.
Now, am I wrong in thinking that they are taking some of what the county traditionally has used for these things and possibly redirecting it to cities and other entities, and therefore might be a loss of resources for the county? Who is the primary provider of those services? Exactly. Yeah.
Well, the Mental Health Services Act was adopted by Prop 1, which is the Behavioral Health Services Act, so it's replacing it. I understand that there are some changes to funding that will happen as a result of that. So more funding going towards housing and treatment for the most severely ill individuals, which is good, but would take away potentially from other programs. But again, we just haven't seen all the exact implications of that. I am excited to hear that the governor's releasing more of this money up front to make sure that we can really jumpstart these projects. When it comes to building facilities, which is what a lot of that money is for, it takes a long time. So it makes sense to front load it now, and construction costs only go up over time. So I think that's very sensible.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how important this issue is to Humboldt County? We have a fair amount of people who are suffering from mental illness, a lot of homeless, especially in recent years. Talk a little bit about the need for facilities and potentially places to house people.
Yeah, absolutely. We need more beds for folks who need essentially supportive housing. They need care that's more intensive than what they could get just in traditional housing if they get an apartment, and they for various reasons wouldn't be able to successfully stay housed and stay well without that level of care and support. So supportive housing, and even a greater level of care, potentially beds that will be available for people that are not able to leave on their own recognizance if that's medically necessary. And of course, those decisions are made, really carefully. But that's certainly a need. I think all of us who live here see it every day. And there are folks that are really hard to serve, and that's what this is really targeted at. So I'm hopeful. I'm also concerned about the impacts locally, but it has passed, so we will adapt however we can.
There's a lot of that, like waiting to see what falls from the sky and dealing with it, right? I mean,
absolutely.
That seems like the small government's role, unfortunately. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is that at the recent meeting, they were talking about how the number of cannabis cultivation permits has dropped. I understand that over the last few years, we haven't received that many at all. What's your feeling on where the cannabis industry is at right now? I know that Measure A went down, and there was a lot of concern about what that might do to the industry in the future. But now that that's gone, that threat is over with, where do you see the cannabis industry going, and what can the county do to improve that?
Great questions. Right now, so in our recent meeting, we decided to do very little, frankly, around our existing ordinance, our cannabis land use ordinance, because we're seeing this dwindling number of permits, because the planning department and the planning commission are still, catching up to the existing permits that we do have. We're seeing some fallowing of land, some folks who are not growing and who are not planning to renew. So there's a lot of moving parts, and we're waiting to see how that all shakes out before we adapt our land use ordinance again. I think there is some interest in making changes to that, and I think some folks would like to see more flexibility, and some folks would like to see it be more rigorous. But right now, we're going to wait and see how it pans out this year before making any major changes. Okay. And I'm not sure what the future will hold for that industry, but I'm hopeful that we can still find a niche and continue to have a niche as a boutique cannabis producer in particular.
Absolutely. We have the reputation. It would be a shame to not be able to capitalize on that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming in once again. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks you. Thanks you. Yeah.
Thanks, folks. Have a good weekend. Stay tuned. Stay informed.